Hey, MBA hopefuls. We're on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly broadcast talking about all things business and education. We stream live every Tuesday and we bring you tons of tips to help you get into the top rated MBA programs, to get you up close and personal with many of the business schools that we host on the show and professionals in the field where you can get your questions answered. And if you like this week's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Today on episode 117, we're talking with friend and colleague Vince Ricci, college and grad school counselor. How do I say your last name? How do I say it? Did I mess up?
Ricci.
I messed
It's
up.
Italian. Ricci.
Vince Ricci. Okay, cool. And we are excited to have him. I've known Vince for many years through AGAC. And so big welcome to you, Vince Ricci. And a warm welcome to our co-hosts. How's everyone doing today?
Great.
Yeah?
Here, cool. Yeah.
Amazing.
Okay, it's awesome to see everyone. We're actually spanning many areas around the globe. So I'm feeling this like synergy. We're like all around the globe right now. It's pretty amazing. So Vince, is going to be talking to us about interview, which is super important. How do you present yourself? How do you say people's names? How are you accurate with those kinds of things? And so I just want you to tell us a little bit about, what is an interview and why would a business school want this?
Thank you, Bara. And an interview is a conversation, and that's the first thing that people don't understand. So I'm based over here in Japan, where there's a lot of fear about speaking English, and so folks over here, but not only folks here too, in the States as well, I think all over the world, get really worried about they think it's a performance, a speech, a test, and it really is fundamentally a conversation. Should be.
That's a great way of presenting it, because when you think of a presentation, right, it's much more formal and it's much more forward and it's much more flat in a way. But conversation, and I often say this and people love it, it's a dance, right? It's a dance back and forth. So that's a great way of talking about it, a conversation.
Definitely. And Vince, I like the fact that you point out that it's not a speech, it's not a show or a presentation. I mean, it is a conversation, and it's a very different form than, say, like a video essay where you're speaking to a camera and it's not an interaction. It's that would be more of a monologue versus a dialogue, or, if there's multiple people. Before I ask my first real question, I can't help but notice your awesome background, which looks very festive. Tell us about that for a second. What's going on there?
So it's a little odd, right? It's the only photo I have on this machine that I'm using, this laptop. And also it's topical because this is my improv reunion that happened in April. 30 years of, I'm blocking her, but that's our guru, sensei, teacher lady, Patricia Ryan Madsen. Her book is Improv Wisdom. She started the improvising troupe while I was an undergrad decades ago. And it's going strong. She's long since retired, emeritus, all that.
This came back. Stanford, right?
This is at Stanford, and I helped her TA her online Zoom course. She's still teaching. Started doing Zoom with COVID, and then now she's going to go actually back to the classroom. She's amazing, and it's just sort of my favorite. There's some of my favorite people in the world.
I love that. So you got into improv acting while you were at Stanford back in the day in 19 and I don't know you that well. We met like 6 months ago at the AGAC conference in New York, and I took a liking to you right away. You're very dynamic, and then finding out that you were an actor, just okay, that makes sense. So you act, you do improv, and I think that plays very much into the way you coach on interviewing, and that's why I was interested in having you on the show today. So first of all, thank you for joining us, and let me ask my actual real question. My first real question is, what makes the difference between a business school MBA interview from other kinds of interviews?
So it's a great question. There's, of course, job interviews. So the students that we coach, and Krithika's doing a lot of career work, I know. So you could have an internship interview, a job interview. An MBA interview is, first of all, an admission interview. That's one primary difference. And then on top of that, business school, as we all know, Yeah, it's not a super academic degree, right? Not medical, not law, all the graduate degrees in all kinds of engineering and everything else you could study in grad school, social sciences and everything else. Business school, there's some skills, and there's also a lot of networking, right? There's also a lot of relationship building, because business is usually not done in a vacuum. So an MBA interview is especially interactive and dynamic, I would say.
For sure. That makes sense.
And and I have to say that I like how you put it as a conversation, because in this part of the world, whenever you're having as we call it, an interview, and not an interview, here in this part of the world, what we see is typically for evaluation of understanding of a concept, or you're actually like speaking to somebody, you already have a rehearsed script and so on. So, but when you go into a conversation, you're just going to respond to what you hear, right? So it's pretty interesting. So now, like, there's a lot of rise of the, generative AI tools. So essays can be written, can be manipulated, and so on. So how important is the MBA interview in the whole application process, especially now?
I love this question, and I can't answer definitively, but we were all together at the AGAC conference, and this topic came up, not specifically the interview, but just AI in general. I would hope it's even more important, because so far, as of today, those tools can't fake this level of interaction, right? I am actually here right now. There isn't a tool that I know of yet, at least in the market, that I could have. You could be talking to virtual Vince, right? And I could be interacting with you guys as if, so I would hope that it's almost increasingly important, because it's still real, it's still authentic. That's why it's my favorite part of the MBA admission process as a coach, is because I can't, you could pay someone to write your essays, or you could use a tool to write them now, but no one else can do the interview for you so far.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. First of all, I wonder how long it's going to be, right? Until that's happening. And I remember all those movies from like the 80s and 90s, like AI with the little boy, or like even that other one with the man has a relationship with that woman. All AI. Virtual Vince does have a ring. I mean, it sounds good. What about
my initials are VR, so whatever.
Just saying, right? So one of the things that I've often been curious about is the idea of interviews being, is it going to be with people that are on staff, on faculty, or alumni? And I'm curious about who's really making the ultimate admissions decision, or how are they actually rating you when you have different people with different roles doing the interviews?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I got to give props to Harvard, which should be the gold standard, and in this case is, their paid full-time staff do the interviews, I think, at great expense and time commitment, because it's just you guys all know what's unique about the culture there in the case method, and they are testing for a very specific thing that is heavily conversation based, and you need to be able to deal with a lot of spontaneity and unpredictability. And frankly, I wish every school had the paid staff do it, the professionals in the room. As you guys all know, some schools do, current students, some, as you said, alumni, and all kinds of other variations. So yeah, it's there aren't that many variables. And I actually made a chart years ago about this, that's somewhere on my website, where I show sort of the branching tree of, like, if alumni, then, and as you think, well, let me not go into a rabbit hole with this one. Let me just briefly answer your question. At the end of the day, the admissions team, the admissions directors, the admissions officers make the final decision. So if it's anyone other than them doing the interview, it's a report, a rubric, some grading sheet is filled out, passed back to them. And I always tell my students, it would take a lot for that grading sheet to change your fate. They would have to say, knows nothing about our school, doesn't display the culture we seek. It'd have to be just like absolutely saying, doesn't fit, didn't know something, didn't know what town we're based in. I don't know, said the wrong name of the school, It would have to be something really profound. And I don't mean to say it's not important. It's just that alumni interviews, it's outsourced. Current students, it's outsourced. Current students are well trained, hopefully. Alumni sometimes are well trained. Sometimes, we all talked about this at the conference. Certain schools I won't name, lots of reports about weird things happening in interviews, power dynamics, and just bizarre behavior. Right? It's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, admission staff makes the choices, and I wish, therefore, if they care about the interview, they should conduct them.
Yeah. Barry, you're on mute.
I mean, it makes a lot. Thank you, Eric. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to have this sort of checklist, but I go down the rabbit hole where how do you like normalize it when you have so many different alumni who have different experiences, different backgrounds, and that, like you said, they're not professionals, right? And when you have something like you're talking about Harvard's program as it being a real clear conversation that they're looking for things, then we're probably, and correct me if I'm wrong or steer me in the right direction, it's not just what you say, but how you say it, right? And that's where I think some of this improvisational work that you've been doing for decades is so valuable, right? It's how are you in the moment and how do you show up in a way? And improvisation isn't just comedy, right? It's also it's being so present that you can trust yourself in being in the moment of showing up the way that you want to show up. So
it's tough. I mean, like, you have schools that are trying to meet the demand for a lot of people wanting an interview. Some schools have certain rounds or moments where they will guarantee that. Others, it's case by case and so forth. But it's hard, and so I can understand why certain schools need to outsource. In theory, they are trained, whether it's alumni or current students,
right?
Because you're depending on someone who's volunteering their time. Even if they're a student, they're still volunteering their time. And by the way, they're taking their MBA, which is pretty intense already. A professional is a professional. They've been doing this for years. And also the fact that they've sat through already probably hundreds, if not more, interviews, you develop a sensibility. It's like when you're leading letters of recommendation, you could sniff out a BS reference in a heartbeat because it's just experience. And that's what being a professional is. But I wanted to get back to the formats because I know they can be so different, Vince. What are some of the different formats before we get into like your technique? What are some of the different types of MBA interviews you encounter with your clients?
Increasingly video, Zoom based. Michigan has this group exercise. Wharton famously, right, has this team based thing.
Right.
I love how a lot of the European schools in Seattle, HEC, you get interviewed by 2 alumni. I think that's brilliant because it sort of hopefully hedges against, there's just more data. And why not? It's twice as many volunteers. It's not a cost. Staff has to read 2 reports, but man, I love that. I really wish if the schools in the States are going to stick with 1 alumni, go to 2 alumni. Why not? Just gives a different perspective.
Especially with the huge alumni base that they have, the huge class they have the resource. Also,
and
a lot of
schools say they do it to keep alumni engaged. Well, great, twice as many alumni.
Right.
So, but does that answer that's so the rough and dirty of the formats?
Sometimes schools will have, if it's within alum or somebody they've outsourced, the interview will be recorded. This way, if there's ever any dispute about, hang on, this is perhaps unfair treatment or something bias because it wasn't a professional, they can always refer to that. So it should be putting people at ease.
Right. And I must say that, schools do spend a lot of time in that bias training because it's so important to give that interviewing experience. And I know a lot of students who place immense value on how they felt in the interview in order to assess whether they want to go to that school or not, even if they get an admit later. So I like to think of it as an opportunity for the students to evaluate the school as well, even though it's a little later in the process. But still, it's a very valid point, and
No, but
it's a
critically, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, as somebody who worked on the other side in recruitment, the interview was absolutely seen as like one of the probably the second to last marketing tool we had before we had them, because the schools are looking to fill those seats, obviously with the highest quality talent possible. But this interview is a way to sell the school and to engage with those people. I mean, it's an emotional sell both ways. That interview, it's reinforcing the concept that it is a conversation. Sorry, Krithika, back to you.
Yeah. No, but I know I can see the enthusiasm there, because I can hear so many stories where they said, like, I had to schedule my interview at such a time and it was so inconvenient. But then, like, the alum was able to change it and treat me in a way that felt nice and squeeze me into the schedule. So you hear all these things, and then you realize that people are getting into the actual world of networking for business school. So I'm curious, Vince, like, how can someone prepare and stand out among the dozens? We know that Kellogg interviews all of them, many of them. So how does someone stand out in an MBA interview?
I mean, in terms of my methodology of how I train people, or just in general across the board?
General, or maybe into your approach as well?
So, practice, and it's weird to say you practice a conversation, but like, like Eric was saying, someone who's a hiring manager or an admissions person who's conducted hundreds of thousands of interviews, it just sort of comes naturally. So as the interviewee, have as many conversations. People do this anyway. They reach out to friends, current students, alums, not to mention professional coaches. And I really think that helps. I liken it to sports more than I don't liken it to acting, because that is like I'm standing on a stage. I'm being Romeo or whoever I am, Iago, whatever. I'm standing up there doing stuff, saying someone else's words. It's not like performance in that sense, or practice. I think of it, and I'm horrible at sports, but whatever, hitting the tennis ball against the wall, practice. And then, to use the tennis analogy, go out and actually play a match with someone at your skill level or above your skill level. So that's the short answer in general for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, practice, like having that kind of toolkit of ideas that you want to share, that if you've rehearsed an interview multiple times, whether first of all in front of a mirror if you really don't have anyone else to do it with, but you could record yourself with your phone, working, as you said, with a professional coach, or just asking a friend, somebody you trust who preferably has a sense of how business school works and the kind of things that they're looking for, to practice. And you're not rehearsing what to say like you're reading a script. No, far from that. But you're rehearsing to have certain elements, certain jewels that you want to like share during the conversation, that they'll be at your fingertips, at the forefront of your brain, and you can draw from that at any time. So I really want to get to what makes you special, Vince, as a coach or interviewing, because that theater background, I love it. You're a seasoned improver and you enjoy improvisation. How, in more detail, how has this impacted you working with students or candidates on the interview specifically?
So the people that I work with who are preparing for a behavioral interview, specifically, I use what I call 16 stories, which is overkill, total overkill. If they ended up with 5 good stories, we're good. But 16 just because it's easy to say. And I have this sort of methodology. There's 4 different types of stories. For each one, you want a successful example and a failure example. For each one, you want a professional example and a personal example. And so that just matrixes out to, if that's a word, 16. And then you practice them. And again, you're not trying to memorize them. You're just trying to have, so that the point is, because I've asked people for years, what are you worried about? What are you worried about? What are you worried about? And everyone's like, unexpected questions. Yeah. Especially behavioral. Tell me about a time when some really specific scenario and you're like, that's never happened to me. Can I say that? So what the 16 thing does is it's virtually impossible to stump you at that point. You've just got a story you could spin to answer any behavioral question that comes up. And I have mixed feelings about behavioral interviews, but they're out there.
What is a behavioral interview? Can you actually describe what that is specifically?
Yeah, it's MIT started using it. Stanford's copied them. Other schools use it a little bit. But the thesis, the premise is past behavior is the only realistic indicator of future behavior. So tell me about a time when. So if I'm trying to find out how you deal with failure, if I somehow sense, Bara, that I'm making this up and I'm projecting on you. Sorry, but like if you're interviewing me and you somehow sense that I'm really uncomfortable not being, that I'm a little bit of a perfectionist or I'm a little bit of a high-strung person, you might dig deeply into failures and you might want to hear multiple examples. And it isn't just question, story, we're done. It's like 10, 15 minutes. Stanford, they're pretty well trained on the alumni side at Stanford. I've seen it where it can be a 10-minute conversation and they're really, at a certain level, they're trying to see if you're lying, but they're asking for like, what did you say in that moment? What did you think they were thinking? And why was that your choice? It's not that they're trying to test you or quiz you or make you fail. It's just that they're really, really trying to get past the veneer of your prepared little script to really see how you think and feel and act in a certain situation that the school might care about. Stanford's a small program, right? And you're doing a lot of work in teams and they're trying to sense, or IMD is a really famous example, right? Tiny, tiny school, all day interview process, intense, some behavioral stuff with like someone watching you from behind a mirror. So they're just trying to suss out that you're really a cultural fit and that you're not faking it. And just like, oh, I'm supposed to act friendly. I'm acting friendly right now. But in reality, I'm super cutthroat, and I should go to a more competitive school. They're trying to figure that out.
I think of this process like, separating the fluff from the true stuff and bringing out like what's in you. Because trust me, like there are people who can write really well, but when it comes to expressing themselves or like even talking about themselves, they're probably not trained to do it in certain cultures. So that becomes like extremely difficult for them. And another thing is like, how many of us even have those 16 stories, like you said? I think that's where the preparation comes in and understanding that this is much deeper than what someone thought about. And I always remember this from one of the EGA conferences. Someone said that we want people who are nice to each other, at least. They should not feel that, oh, I have to go and attend this class because it is going to be intense and you're going to see that same person for 2 years in the US and 1 year in Europe.
It's funny. Like, think about dating, right? People always put their best foot forward, right? And it's not until weeks or months or sometimes years before you really get to know the person. I think if you're looking to go the long term, like maybe 3 years before you really know somebody, or if you can talk about like maybe marriage, that kind of thing. But anyway, I had this friend back in the US who she always insists on going for a drive with the guy, and she likes to drive, but she'll let the guy drive because she wants to see how he's behind the wheel, how he treats other people. Is he cutting people off all the time? Is he like getting freaked out and stressed out? Does he know how to merge? Can he parallel without peeing his pants? So like that. I mean, imagine MBA interviews had the ability to do that behind the wheel. That'd be fun. But yeah, these kind of questions really kind of get to your thought process. That is exactly what you said. To see, and it's probably hard to remember if you're telling a story from 6 years ago. You may not exactly remember, but that's a good thing to practice, right? Thinking about the scenario, maybe in your 16 situation matrix, just thinking that deeply about it. Like, remember, how did you feel? And just take pause and think about, how did you feel? What did the other person think? And sort of reconstruct the situation. So it's, again, available at your fingertips when you're asked such a question without overthinking. I mean, maybe I'm contradicting myself, but it is a lot of prep, but at the same time, not getting to the point where you're, paralysis by analysis.
The other thing I love about it is it's a life skill, because it isn't just about getting admitted. You got to get a job. And then to get a job, you got to get an internship. And so it never ends.
Yeah.
So
it also seems like an interesting process if you don't actually fit into the culture of a school. It's actually to your benefit to not be accepted. Right. Like, if you're not going to fit in and thrive and grow and contribute and feel good, then
it's all about fit, right?
It's all about fit. And so that interview process gives you, like we were talking about before, it gives you an opportunity to get to know, well, who are these people also? And what it is that conversation. I mean, you don't enter a conversation knowing exactly what's going to happen every time, especially someone you've never met before. Right. And so it's just such an amazing back and forth. And I think having that kind of growth mindset in going in, instead of thinking that, oh my gosh, if this goes bad, I mean, it actually might not be going bad. Like what you think is going bad might be that you're a great fit for the school. You know, like who knows? Who knows what that is?
I'm thinking like how to look for somebody like, oh, I didn't get into Harvard and I dodged a bullet. I don't think you're saying that.
Yeah, I mean, it is I mean, I think perspective is everything, right? So.
Right, and this is where like wins, like we're gonna see what you can pull up from your improv toolkit that will work for acing the MBA interview.
You guys have already mentioned most of it. It's showing up. Improv, as you guys have indicated, isn't comedy as much as, for me, as much. I mean, the people in the photo, my weird photo behind me, for those folks, and the improv that I came up doing and still try to get to do whenever I can, it's more about listening than it is about talking. And so that's one of them, is just to be really present. Let me tell a quick story. I thought I wanted an MBA years ago. I ended up getting a different, like, cognitive science master's degree, but I was thinking of MBA. And as you guys know, Kellogg allows you to interview even before you apply. So I was in Chicago seeing some friends, and I just signed up and I went over there, and I had no prep whatsoever. I won't tell you my GMAT score. I mean, it was a really great failure for me. And the woman, I failed the interview because I wasn't listening to her question. I forgot all my improv training. She said to me, Vince, I want to hear about behavioral question. I want to hear a story about a time when you showed leadership, but you didn't have any title. I didn't get it. I was like, well, back when I was director of this and running that. And she's like, no, I want to hear about a time. And she just kept repeating the question. And it was so clear that I was like, didn't fit their culture. I didn't get it at all. Yeah. It was great. A great experience. So, yeah.
Yeah, answering the question is probably a good idea. All right. So besides that, because, you can take a question, right? Especially if it's something you're not totally sure how to answer or handle, maybe you're not totally comfortable with. And as you're kind of formulating a response, sometimes you take them on a journey. And that's okay, as long as you circle back to the original question and make sure that one gets answered. But besides that, what are like the top 3 mistakes you see people usually making with the interview?
I mean, the first one we talked about, just mentally not approaching it right, not approaching it as if it were a conversation, approaching it as if it was any of those other things we mentioned. The second one would be not confirming the question, like I didn't, not listening to it, not confirming it, not answering it correctly. And the third one is just not being gracious, forgetting to say thanks. I mean, you don't want to go out of your way and make them uncomfortable, but just treating it like an opportunity, being thankful. You're so nervous, but just remembering that it's not about you. And isn't that weird? You're trying to get into business school, you thinking it's not about you. It's about the 2 people in the room and the relationship with this person on the other side of the desk, who's a representative of the school you're trying to attend, for which you'll be an alum, whatever you say, alum the rest of your life.
Yep.
So you're all caught up in your prep and you're remembering everything you wanted to say. Just get outside of your head, stay in the moment. Bara knows all about breathing and just presence, mindfulness, all that stuff. Remember all that. Just show up and be remember who you are during the conversation, and be mindful and be thankful. I mean, that sounds very old-fashioned, but manners. I mean, just get outside of your own head enough to be able to enjoy the conversation and be thankful and appreciative of the person across the table or across the world on Zoom.
For sure.
I'm thinking also, I mean, we're talking about improvisation being acting, But improvisation is also playing sports. It's also playing games like chess. It's also playing music, right? And so many people, if people don't have an acting background, they probably have some background somewhere, most likely, maybe, I would think, where you are improvising, right? You are engaged. If nothing else, you've had conversations before, right? If nothing else. So like when you think about music, I mean, how many times have I been to a concert and I'm excited to see the artist, but they play the music just like it is on how I hear it online or on the radio or whatever. And it's not as exciting and it's not as vibrant because they're not actually listening to each other. They're actually just playing it rote. And so the idea of that improvisation and being in the moment and listening, like great, amazing music is in part really listening to people around you. And even, when you go to the symphony, you might know the music, but the conductor is actually leading people through it. And it's going to sound different with different musicians.
Sure. Breathing life into it.
Right. Breathing life into it. So I think that's super important. So speaking of breathing life into something, what are some, can you share some like memorable interview stories or experiences that you've had either with yourself or with clients that you've worked with that you'll protect their identity, of course?
The first one I can think of is a guy we all know, an AGAC founder. I won't say more than that. His funny story was he was interviewing at the most famous school, one of them, and he passed the interview, but the interview experience was so negative that experience caused him to choose, two ranks down, different school, and he was much happier there, right? So it was this experience where, the interview experience told him something about the culture of that school, which gave him such a negative reaction that even though he got the offer to the more prestigious school, he decided to attend a different school where he was much happier.
Good for him for following his heart, and
that was great.
Way more important than ranking.
Neat. Other stories? Any other mishaps that wound up being turned around even? That sometimes happens, right? We have these weird, I know that when I create art, sometimes I'll make a mistake, but the mistake actually opens up the possibility for something else that wasn't planned, right? So even if a student is in that interview and something weird happens, it's a human experience potentially that you can actually draw off of. And that behavioral piece that you're talking about, the person does get to shine through, right?
There was someone who was interviewing in a school that uses behavioral interviews, and she really didn't understand the question. And she had to ask several times for it to be repeated, which actually turned out great because she did get in and did attend the school. So it didn't mean she failed, even though she was so embarrassed for herself. And it wasn't an English thing. It was just the question was so, like, with these behavioral questions, they're so specific. And I think her interviewer was asking it, seeing the outline. She sent me a report. Her goal was such that the question made a lot of sense, but it was so specific. Anyway, she bounced back from this setback, found something to talk about, gave a good answer, long interaction. He dug for detail, and obviously it eased his concern about, it was something about, tell me about a time that you created something without having all the resources you needed. Because their goal was somewhat entrepreneurial in sort of developing countries. It was a stretch kind of a goal, very, very utopian, very idealistic goal. And that the meaning of his purpose of, anyway, it was a great moment where the whole behavioral thing worked out fine. He got what he needed from her, and she was given enough time to sort it out in real time and come up with something that apparently was good enough. And I was of course thrilled for her.
So it's almost like if they asked, "Tell us about your MacGyver past," exactly. It might have been easier, but they didn't.
Exactly. And I think he was improvising. I think he was making up the question on the fly. That was part of the problem.
Yeah. So he was improvising too.
He had a concept, but he was sort of throwing the words together, and it wasn't that natural.
I would think that someone who asks questions is really demonstrating that they want to understand. right? I mean, it's also how you ask the questions, right? The way you ask questions, like, is it that you want to understand, or that you don't want to ask the question, or you're hedging, or you're wanting the question to be something, I mean, all of these things really say so much about the individual, right? And the culture that you're being interviewed with.
Yeah, and that's what I like about it, because what people have to understand is in this conversation, only certain parts are going to be evaluated, as per the rubric and given back to the team to decide. So they can treat the rest of the pieces as conversations, but they should also be in a position to identify what are those sacrosanct pieces in the conversation that they should be aware of. Example, your goals, why you want to attend that school. And, like if you had mentioned 30,000 in the resume, you would want to stick to 30,000, and it should not be like 300,000 or something and more. So, and this is so surreal right now. It feels like the movie Inception, where we are interviewing Vince about interviews.
It's so meta.
It
So
is.
meta.
It's so meta. Neat. Well,
And I think my avatar is doing a really good job here.
Oh, you're killing
Vince, like, yeah, because now I'm like concerned, like, are you the real Vince? Like, and I think like we should all change our like, spiel and say real Krithika from here and real Eric and so on.
Exactly.
Vince, just quickly, you talked about the 16 points that you share when you're working with students. Is there anything else that you want people to know? Because some people, they could take an improv class, right, to learn how to listen better. But are there any other pieces of advice that you would recommend that are outside of the box or inside of the box that folks can prepare for interviews?
I always just, and Eric already mentioned it, but the two things I talk about are mirror method, which is for the basic questions. Why MBA? Tell me about yourself. Practice those. And I like a mirror more than a phone, just because, it's your phone and it starts beeping and buzzing and someone's sending you a text. Mirror, it's just analog. It's just you standing in front of, wherever in your house, your apartment, your space. And so mirror method, and then the 16 stories. Those are my two core. I don't often encourage people to run out and take an improv class if it's like November and their interviews in 2 weeks, because it's not going to pay dividends in the long term. It's just like Toastmasters, right? Same thing. It's like, well, you could join Toastmasters, but so I think just use the tools you already have. Talk to yourself first of all. Talk to friends and family, current students, alums, coaches. Dogs are good. Dogs love it. Yeah, they.
You don't have one, it's a good time to adopt or foster.
All right.
Just saying.
Especially in the Bay Area.
Yes. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and this has been super fun. And I think we could talk and converse for a really long time about this topic. I want to thank you so much, Vince. It's so nice to see you. I like you in 3D better than 2D, but I'll take what I can get. And it was such a pleasure to have you here. And MBA hopefuls, if you like today's episode, please give us a thumbs up. And be sure to subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all of the trends and the news in the world of MBAs, business, and education. And finally, don't forget to check us out next week, the same time and place, for full access to upcoming and past episodes. Head over to mbawaves.com. Everyone have a great week. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Vince.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.